I wanted to ask about one thing I've seen you be really strongly advocating for, and this is a statewide issue, but I'm wondering if you could tell us about it. What's going on with clergy and mandated reporters? Because I know this is a bill that has come up.
Yeah.
Can you tell people what the issue is, what you're trying to fight for the lawmakers to do, and where we're at right now with that?
Yeah. How about I start from the most recent, which is where we're at right now, which is that I don't know what's going to happen next session. It's still an unresolved issue. So that's the spoiler so far, is that there is no ending yet. So what happened is, so in Washington State, we are one of the few states left now in the country that has not included clergy, like religious leaders, regardless of their actual title, to be mandated reporters. And I'm a former teacher, so for me, I know what goes into being a mandated reporter, and for me, that hat never really comes off. And especially because a lot of the work that I care about, it also includes child welfare and advocacy, and mental health support. And for me, just preventing abuse is part of the suite of mental health services and concerns. So anyway, Washington State doesn't include clergy to be mandated reporters yet. And there have been attempts over, I believe now, the decades to finally rectify that. And now and this is where Washington gets really wonky, and why I think it's really important for viewers to recognize that we're not this blue monolith, right? We have so many weird quirks, and that also includes our kind of, I guess, hand-wringing over how we make sure that we actually, for example, keep kids safe. So because of my work on the Association of Secular Elected Officials, I was able to first learn that we didn't have this on the books through some other webinars we did. So then I started talking with some legislators that I thought, would be especially intrigued to kind of work on this issue. And I finally learned that there was a bill that was being proposed that would make sure that clergy were added as mandated reporters. So like if they see child abuse, if they suspect child abuse or neglect, they have to tell they have to tell the authorities, right?
And this seems like it should be a gimme.
Yeah.
Like even religious organizations should say, well, yeah, we want to protect the children. So if we learn about it, of course we're going to do what's in the child's best interest.
Right. And you'll often actually, and this is what's interesting, is by and large, you will hear religious leaders saying that they're for this. And this adds the extra interesting layer to all of this. So here's what happened also is the bill was actually probably just going to sail through a few years ago. And that was because some of the folks working on the bills, including Democratic lawmakers, were really working closely with the Catholic Conference, with the Bishops' Lobby Group, to make sure that also there were exemptions such as confession. That was where we actually, also with atheist organizations, including with the American Atheists and American Humanist Association, we stepped in to say, why are we making exemptions for child abuse? And that was what actually caused much more of the controversy this time around, which was saying we shouldn't provide any aiding and abetting of child abuse. So last session, that was about to go.
There are actual stories of people, like abusers, going into a confessional booth telling a priest, yeah, I have abused a kid. It's happening right now. And then the problem here is the priest says, well, that sucks. Oh, well, say some Hail Marys, but I'm not going to report that even if it could save the child because you told it to me in this act of confession. You would think it's a gimme to say, yeah, but if that seems like a fair exception to the rule of whatever your code of secrecy is.
Yes. And that's what's so, that's just something of that makes my blood boil, because I'm thinking about how when I was a teacher, to me, the biggest parallel I can draw, even though I know this is not what the religious organizations would be comparing, is like if a parent were to go to a student conference night and disclose that they were abusing a kid to me, it'd be like saying, oh, well, you disclosed it at a PTA night or at conferences, so therefore I don't have to tell anybody. And that's the way I see this is, yes, there are acts in certain faiths that are sacred, and yet what is sacred about protecting child abuse? And to me, that's where I think the state really does need to step up and say, we're protecting vulnerable children, vulnerable people in general, that don't necessarily, they didn't even choose the religion. They're showing up, and they should be safe in their house of worship. And that was, to kind of get ahead of
And
myself.
usually when you want
Yeah.
to interfere with some religious belief, I mean, there has to be an overwhelmingly good reason for the state to get involved in something like that. And I mean, if preventing a child from getting abused doesn't cut it, what the hell does?
Well, exactly. And I think this is, I should probably take a step back, because I'm, in the world of like mandated reporter training. Like, you have to do that to be licensed as a teacher. And at least in Washington, I'm sure pretty much everywhere, I'd hope. But yeah, you have to tell the information that and you have to go through a bunch of questions to say as much information as you can provide. And even if it's a really vague understanding, like, I heard a kid who sounded like they were under 10 years old. They told me this. It was at this place that they told. Like, you just provide what you know. You don't have, and that's really the big issue to all of this, is even if you don't know the full story, like the full name or anything like that, share what you know. I mean, it's almost like, it's kind of funny that I'd be calling it the Good Samaritan law, right? I mean, I realize that's biblical, but like recognizing that's kind of part of it. You're trying to avoid the bystander effect. And so the fact that this is the huge argument is that this breaks the seal of confession, and that we heard from the bishop lobby groups, that priests would rather go to jail than, and like kind of creating this martyrdom narrative of like, we would rather go to jail than support an abused child, is unconscionable. And the fact that, again, even in my own party, we were kind of coddling this, more than kind of, we were coddling this, is deeply upsetting to me, because that's an abuse of the First Amendment.
Sure. And so just to get back to the point here,
Mm-hmm.
you are advocating for them to pass this bill to make sure clergy are mandated reporters, regardless of how they found out about, alleged abuse. And why is that? So, and obviously these bishops, Catholic Church representation, maybe the Mormon Church as well, they are fighting on this. And why do the Democrats, are they pushing forward with it anyway, or are they folding like immediately?
Yeah, so that's the next wrinkle of the story from last year to this year. So, and I should really give shout outs also, because I was thinking about the chilling stories you were mentioning. Through this work, I was able to connect both with, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, who were actually, one of whom was actually the whistleblower for this major abuse cover up with the Jehovah's Witnesses that became news in Investigate West. And that's actually what really kicked off this work for the last few iterations of this kind of bill, was really the work of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. But also I've been able to connect with survivors of clergy abuse in the Catholic Church. And the last time I think we were connecting, I was actually about ready to stand with them, literally, in front of the Attorney General's office in Olympia to create a set of demands, including that they want a hotline for, an abuse hotline, and they want more of a public investigation for the Attorney General. And I realize that this is kind of getting a little bit off, but it's relevant to this, of also talking about, we have a Democratic Attorney General, a Democratic Governor's office, all of these points, and we're still not listening to survivors when it comes to the case of abuse when it happens in a church setting.
Are they just worried about the pushback from the religious? Is that all?
I think so. I think there's a lot of hand wringing, and to me, maybe at least my impression of this, I'd be glad to be proven wrong, is this is almost this seems to be an extension of the sort of passive aggressive Pacific Northwest nice that we have, where we want to be like, I'm tolerant, so therefore I'm going to tolerate what should be otherwise in any other setting intolerable. So, this has been a coalition of work where people who are survivors are pushing back, including these survivors of Catholic, clergy abuse, who are still Catholics, who are saying, look, this is my faith. I still believe in the tenets of this religion. I just don't believe in what church leadership is doing. And we're still ignoring that. And that this goes to that point of the First Amendment, where suddenly, whose First Amendment rights are we now restricting? Because here now we have children. We have active parishioners who say, I don't feel safe in church. So who are we protecting here now? And again, that goes back. And is it even the First Amendment? I'd say no.
Let me change gears for a second. If you were in office, what could you do as a sitting lawmaker that maybe you can't do right now?
Yes.
At
So
least
this
on
is
this issue.
Yeah, especially this issue. So this has the extra layer to the story. I like how the question keeps telling a little bit more of the story each time. So what we ended up with this last session, really interestingly, was between last and this session, more of the exemption issue came to be the focal point of the bills. So last year, especially thanks to House committee members, they said no, we should remove the exemption for child abuse in clergy in confession settings. Like that's just that is a no starter if we allow abuse to be, kind of given cover of darkness in a confession booth or whatever similar practice there is in other faiths as well. So that actually became the rub between last session and this session. Was the Senate, even though it's controlled by Democrats, refused to really move the needle on issues related to the clergy bill. The House was for saying no exemptions. A lot of Democratic lawmakers, and I think some Republicans, if I recall correctly, were okay with it. But there were enough people who were on the fence about this to create that bill fizzling out, let's say. So this last session, that would be what I do. I mean, yes, I'm running for the House position, which is not where necessarily the biggest hangup is, although I really want to make sure that even as a House member, I am advocating with senators to say, no, there should be no excuse for child abuse. And at least the prime sponsor of these bills in the Senate side, Senator Noel Frame, doing amazing work, was a House rep. So I do think that there's a lot more to be done for making sure that we have those allies in the House and the Senate to really make a concerted effort. And that's where, again, I'm a coalition builder. A lot of my policy work, and especially so I could survive and really get things done locally, came from the fact that I know it can't always happen in the halls of power, which I think goes back to your original question of how you get involved as an activist and how you learn what's changed. Is I really think a lot about, I know the impact of what happens when there are committed activists or just people in general in the community who care. I mean, regardless of whether or not they call themselves activists, who really put pressure on lawmakers. So feeling that side and understanding that and knowing how to work with those stakeholders is also what moves the needle. That's how I'm running. That's how I've been serving. So that's what I would just be continuing at a different level in Olympia.
Yeah, I feel like this is something I've heard. Again, Washington, a different state than, say, a Democrat in a very red state. But sometimes, even if you can't get the bill you want, being able to advocate for it from that position gives it a little more seriousness. It makes people listen to you a little more when you're in that position and using your leverage, whatever you have, to push for it. That helps.
Yeah.
Not to change the subject from that one thing, but there's so much I want to ask you about. One thing I've always thought about, you mentioned this. I think of Washington State as a fairly blue state, even though there are rural areas there. And Democrats have a reputation for basically relying on urban voters and more or less ignoring rural voters. But Black Diamond, I believe, is a relatively rural place. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. How do you and how does your party find a way to connect with those voters who Democrats have, for better or for worse, ignored?
That is like the bulk of exactly why I'm running too, is really to continue to shed that light on what it means to be a rural or more exurban Democrat or just person in general in this state. I mean, I don't know how much all of your listeners wanted to go into how wild the scene is right now in some of the big urban areas like Seattle. For a long time, Seattle was kind of given the boogeyman reputation, especially in far right outlets. There have been some weird changes to areas like Seattle. I would say right now it's like a phoenix with its head cut off, and it's going through a little bit of a whatever life crisis it is in now. So this is the other part of where I think it's really important for us to be working more cohesively, including as a state, is there are, I mean, I could go into so many examples about policy-wise where both, especially the Senate, failed to do some things, but also on how we need to make sure that we're bringing along rural folks on for the ride, and especially when it comes to housing policies and transportation access and on the environment. So here's a very good local example of where I'm frustrated right now with how I also think our party needs to do better with listening to more rural voters. So very locally, and actually this is a huge topic of conversation in my community, there might be the chance that we're going to change a green space essentially to allow for a, a gravel mine, which is going to literally poison the well. That's going to create huge deleterious effects on rural communities, regardless, again, of what they, who they actually vote for otherwise. And this is where I think, I don't know if we'll agree on every single social issue, but yeah, you should have safe water and a safe road to live in. And if you live in a rural community, you should be able to, trust that this is a place that, stays green, and keep the urban areas urban and make sure that we're preserving our green spaces. So I think to really answer those questions, though, also about what that means for that rural urban divide is I do live in a more rural area. And I wanted an area too where people said Democrats can't win, and especially maybe a more secular person can't win. We can. And I do think it's to our huge disservice in this state that we continue to ignore more rural communities because we think we don't have the votes, which is cynically what I've actually been told, even in this election, is, well, where you live, you just don't have the votes. And it's like, this is why we don't actually do the things we need to do in Washington. And this is where I think it goes to the cultural question of where we are as a state, is we are continuing to exacerbate this issue where suddenly we think about the urban areas as kind of getting more of the support, more of the resources, including on transportation issues. And suddenly we leave the rural folks kind of out there on their own. And that's at least the feeling. Whether or not that's true, that's the perception. And I think electorally that does kind of, bode as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but this is the whole reason why I'm running, is I was actually just flat out told that, we're more rural, so we don't have as many voters. So why should I care?
When you've knocked on doors in those areas where I'm guessing they're not used to seeing a lot of Democrats come into their homes, what's the reaction been when you speak with them?
Yeah, well, for one, I'm really excited that there have been so many times when even more conservative folks said, yeah, even if I don't agree with you on everything, I know where you stand. And I trust that. And I think that's a really key piece that we can't emphasize enough, is especially in this political climate, including when we've seen times when that our dialogue has gone off the rails, it's often been because people just want a clear answer about where somebody stands. So I've gotten a lot of even somebody saying, you tell it like it is. And I'm like, right? I mean, I'm still like floored that I got that answer. And I'm like, well, I mean, in this case, I think when I'm talking about, human rights and the environment, I think that is what it is. But anyway, to that point, there's that aspect. I don't know. I'm thinking about so many different parts of that as well. But also when I'm at the doors, people say, I still remember my first time running where somebody was asking about our governor, because at the time he was running for president. And they asked him all these questions about like China and, climate change. And I'm like, I can't do anything about whatever China decides to do, but let's go back to talk about the bears and the elk on your lawn in our wetlands. And they're like, yeah, I might not agree with you on the national stuff, but if you can help with the elk in my yard, I'll vote for you. And so
that's
yeah.
not, I've heard this not personally, but from like a transgender candidate who ran in a very red area where they said all the stuff that comes up when we think about civil rights, LGBTQ rights, by and large, I'm not running for those issues, even though we may disagree on those issues. I'm running to fix your potholes. I'm running to get businesses in our community. And on those issues that are more local, more state level, you'll find a lot more overlap between partisans at the national level, I would imagine.
Yeah. And I recall hearing that story from the candidate that you were talking about and going, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like all of these things are so crucial to our our own personal identities, but also in the fabric of our democratic institutions. And at the end of the day, what matters is that we're trying to improve people's quality of life. And again, I think that's where it's really where I think there's a really unique lens of what it means to be a humanist and atheist in office, to say, I just want us to have nice things because I don't know if we're going to get another shot at this.
Let me ask you, just so everyone's aware. So you are currently running for the state legislature. Can you give us the layout of how that works specifically in Washington? Your primary is coming up, I believe, next week. But like, how does that work? Is it just how many candidates are in the race? Who are you running against in the primary? Is there any weirdness going on in Washington that may not apply to other states?
You know, I still like to say we're the better Washington. We're definitely the weirder Washington. So first off, I guess it'll be interesting to know that we have a little bit more time on the primary. In fact, we have 5 more months. So we have an August primary where it's the first Tuesday of the month. So I have a little more time, which is great.
Good.
It does,
Sorry about
yeah.
that. My mistake.
Oh, no. You're good. I know most people, again, we're the weirder Washington. Maybe I should just call it that way. And also to kind of add to that level for the primaries is we have an interesting system of the top 2 primaries, the top 2 system, which means regardless of your party, the 2 highest vote getters move on, which has meant that there have been times even on statewide races where it's been Democrat versus Democrat or Republican versus Republican. It does happen that way. So I don't know what it's going to look like for this particular race, because I feel like, I've been going a mile a minute already, and but for a lot of people, they're just starting to really, really tune in. So who knows how many more people will jump in, but there are, I want to say now 4 more people in addition to me, and now Republicans too, which, adds an interesting level and dynamic to the conversation as well. And I think to the earlier question, at least what that means for my LD race is in my legislative district, we've had representation from one city in a pretty big geographic space. You can say what you want about redistricting. It was awful. But this is where people also ask me to run, is you have additional perspectives that can inform and help the rest of this legislative district and the rest of our state. Because right now we have a lot of policies being made and advocated for in our legislative district that really reflects the interests of that city and its own dynamics, which includes that it has the political and economic capital to do some of the housing and environmental social programs that other cities like mine simply can't. Like, I could go into also issues related to, our tax policy and how we're cash strapped in small rural towns. I won't here. That's not the question. But I do think that that's what's going to make this an interesting race here in this very local race is we might have other Democrats, but it's also going into the sense of who is going to actually be representing our full communities and who's going to be giving all of our communities the time of day to really care about these issues. And I think also to some extent, how much are we going to be too worried about playing it safe and not really delving into the fact that we have some serious cultural, conversations that we need to have, and how are we going to address them? Like, how are we going to address the fact that I'm living in an area where we had Moms for Liberty threatening people I love and care about? And I think to that question about the state politics, we have a lot of that. And I think because of that exacerbated like rural and urban, and in addition to party lines, we're really seeing that come to an impasse in our state, because we do, and I think especially in comfortably blue areas, we think of this as an abstract, it's out over there. And people have told me, like, I wouldn't even canvass in Black Diamond because it's too scary. And it's like, but this is where the action needs to happen. I know this is kind of going in a few different directions from your original question, but
no, it's okay.
Yeah.
So I have other candidates jumped into the same race yet? They have already, and there are Democrats in that race already. How do you stand out from those other Democrats, and how do you make a case for yourself without necessarily, I guess, putting them down if they're the ones on the ballot or something? Because I imagine that's this fine line you have to tiptoe around. Like, how do you stand out and make your case for why you're the Democrat that people should vote for?
Yeah, I think, in my ramblings, and I'll admit it was rambling in the earlier question, was kind of getting to that same question where we do have more of a crowded primary now. And it is interesting that, again, I was asked to run because, community leaders out in my part of the district asked me to run to make sure that we were bringing more attention to the rest of the district, and really in ways that I think help the rest of the state, because I live in a rural area that's growing like wild, like astronomically, due to some state policy issues we won't get into, but really saying we need to have more direct attention on where are the work that we're talking about, the growth in the state is happening most. And I feel like that's being excluded. And so that's the choice that I think, voters in my area are going to have to be making, is about how much attention are we going to give to communities like mine, or are we going to give it lip service and then continue to repeat the same way of doing things in the hopes that it trickles down to, and I do actually mean trickles down to places like mine, even though we're higher up geographically. So, I've been involved in trying to build the bench out here locally because I knew what it meant for my race. But we'll have to see what pans out here as well, because we do have other Democrats. And I'd say that there's, like any Democratic race, we have those interesting dynamics of how much do we want to, be status quo, and how much do we want to make sure that we're really, I think, being more bold in how we bring people and new people along.